Good afternoon, and thank you for choosing to spend a part of your Sunday afternoon with us. We are happy to have you at Welcoming Wellness, where we are empowering mental health. We are an initiative of White Plains United Methodist Church in Cary, North Carolina. Our goals are to provide knowledge and education in the field of mental health so that we, as caregivers, can provide the best care for our loved ones that we can. We also want to create a community of support where people are not afraid to step forward and say, hey, I need some help. So anyway, let me talk just a moment about a few housekeeping things for those of you who are here in our in-person audience. If you need
your mic on, we can hear you, but I'm not sure your mic. We don't have the internal ones. So.
You don't have those on?
You want one?
Yeah. Excuse me. Do we have people on Zoom? Okay. Are we ready now? Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. And I apologize to those of you on Zoom as well. We have a little bit of new technical stuff going on here, so we're trying to get adjusted. If you need something, the volunteers have badges on. Most of you know where the restrooms are because you have been here before. I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones if you would do that, because it makes it very difficult for Zoom to get a clear audio if there's other noise in the room. If you need to get up and move about, please feel free to do so. But if you would, please try to move about behind the cameras. Our Zoom camera is here. Our videographer is in the back. So if you will go behind the cameras if you need to move around. And we are only videotaping the speaker. So that's for privacy reasons. Now, if you have questions, you have a clipboard that says questions on one side of the note card and resources on the other. Please write your questions down. We won't be taking them out loud. If you are on Zoom today with us, then if you would put your question in the Q&A box, you can mark it anonymous if you'd like to, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. So today we're going to hear from Kris Ford, and Kris has been with us before and talked about grief in adults. Today she's going to talk about grief in children and teenagers because that's a very different issue. She's been working in the grief and the grief support field for 30 years. So she's been an advocate, and she's going to talk to us about the long-term effects that grief can have on children if it's not resolved. So let's give Kris a hand and invite her on up.
Our objectives this afternoon are for you to gain a better understanding of children's grief and maybe even gain some very specific tools for working with a grieving child. 1 in 10 children in North Carolina will experience the death of a parent by age 18. That's 235,000 children, or 10.2% of the children in North Carolina. Ours is a little higher than the national average, which is 8.9%. That number more than doubles if we look at youth up to age 25. 1.6% will experience the death of a sibling by age 17. 97% of teachers have said that there has been an visible impact on children in school. 97%. Teachers notice that. Bereaved children are 2 times more likely to experience significant challenges at home in behavior if they've experienced the death of a parent or a sibling at an early age. 1 in 4 youth try suicide, and they have experienced bereavement as a youth. Bereaved youth are 175% more likely to develop a substance abuse disorder. Those are pretty staggering statistics, I think. 86 to 92% of young people in drug and rehabilitation treatment programs have experienced the death of someone important. 1 in 5 is likely to develop a psychiatric disorder. The highest rates of reported difficulties are often found in boys. This is an older statistic, like as in 2000, but I checked and it hasn't changed, unfortunately. In a survey of 300 incarcerated teens, 96% indicated that someone significant in their lives had died, and that was as a youth. Every time I hear about some sort of shooting or shooting deaths, all those sorts of things, violence where teens are involved, the question I ask myself is, I wonder what happened to that child as a younger child. I wonder what kind of loss they've experienced, because I just know that that connection is very, very strong. So I want to go through some just basic assumptions about grief in general. It's true about adults and it's true about children. First of all, grief is normal. It's not a disease. It is a normal response to something that happens to us that interrupts an attachment that we have to someone or something. Grief is a whole body experience. It's not just a head and heart thing. It's a very physical experience. And I want to talk a lot more about that in terms of children. Grief is cumulative and unfolds over the lifespan of an individual. So when we talk about grief and talk about doing work around grief, what we recognize, even with adults, but certainly with children, is that we're doing the work of a particular season. Because as a child moves through a developmental point, pivotal point in their life, those kinds of losses often raise their heads back up to the surface, and there is a new kind of grieving. It's not as acute or intense generally, but it is grieved, again, from a different place in their life. And this is true of adults as well. Grieving is not about forgetting. In fact, it's about what I call remembering. That is bringing back together the parts of ourself that get lost in the midst of grief. How often we hear from adults, and sometimes I hear parents talking about grief to their children, and what they're saying is, we're just going to forget about that, and we're going to move forward. Well, we don't just forget about that. We don't move forward if that's the instruction that we have. In general, when we're talking about grief, these are not things that we want to forget. Even if they're difficult, awful experiences, we want to take forth something from that. Something. So forgetting is not the end result or end desire. The last thing is that trauma overrides grief. So if a child has had a traumatic experience, that is an experience that takes them outside the internal tools they have to manage a highly stressful event. They're unable to manage that event with the tools they have. It's traumatic. And grief is certainly a part of that experience. But before the grief can be fully addressed, the trauma must be addressed. They can be addressed sort of along the same together, but some initial work around the trauma has to happen in order for that grief to be addressed appropriately. One that's not on here, and I don't know why it's not, I need to add it to this slide, it's just very obvious, that grief is unique to every single individual. No two children, no two adults grieve in the same way. Even if it's the same loss, even if it's the same relationship in a family, it's not the same. So it's important to remember that our grief is sort of like our fingerprint. It's that unique. I love this quote from Nancy Boyd Webb, who's one of the greatest child therapists around. She says, "Discussion about death today still represents a powerful taboo. This taboo contradicts the reality of the contemporary child's life. We as families, as adults, don't do very good at talking about death. We avoid it like the plague. And the reality is our children can't do that. It's all around us. And to ignore it in some way, especially for younger children, when it's happening and we're ignoring it, the message we're sending is that it's so big we can't even talk about it. It's so big we can't even talk about it. And I don't think that's the message we really want to send to our children. We need to be talking about that. So let's talk about specifically some unique characteristics for children's grief. Children feel different and isolated when they're grieving. And I'm going to say adults do too in some ways, but children, it is really amazing to me after working with kids in grief for about 30 years. I've had a number of kids tell me, I feel like I have on a name tag that says my mom died, or my dad died, or my brother died, or whatever. I just feel different. And part of the reason they feel different is because it's not talked about. One of the first questions I always ask children when they would come in to our program is I would say, do you know anybody else whose mom or dad has died? No. 99.9% no. And I can guarantee you that at their school, and probably even in their class, there are other kids who had that experience, but they don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at school. We don't talk about it at home. We don't talk about it in the neighborhood, which encourages that sense of isolation. And it's another layer of grief, because the average 9-year-old who has a parent who's died is missing out on that sense of belonging and really being pulled into that group of peers when they are feeling different and isolating themselves because they feel that way. Does that make sense to you? Secondly, grief is a physical experience for children, even much more than it is for adults. And that's because kids are more in touch with their body than adults are. Most of us as adults, we just don't pay much attention to our bodies until it's so bad that we have to be mowed down or flat on our back. A kid is going to tell you when their tummy hurts, or when their head hurts, or when they just don't feel good. They're in touch with their bodies. And one of the things that I know from working with children in school who are grieving, the school nurse is usually the first person in the school to know that there's been a death in a family or some other kind of big loss, because those kids go to the nurse's office about 3 times as often, because they have these physical responses and they're real. This is not psychosomatic, folks. It's real. Their tummies hurt. They have a headache. Their bodies hurt. And we need to be paying attention to that with them. One of the things that I've always done in my work with children is I don't care where we are, whether in my office or in a place where we have a playground to really be physical, I'm doing physical work with kids. We're always doing physical things. One of the things I do is I often take a game that would be a game like you'd play on a board game. And I use either tiles or those foam squares, and we make it on the floor. And we play the game on the floor. Not down on the floor, but walking, like we're walking around those squares, we're rolling a dice and walking. And instead of just answering a question or doing something like picking up a red card, the red card says, let's do 5 jumping jacks before we answer the question. And it's just getting them moving their bodies so that some of the stress and the tension and those big, big, big feelings can be moved around in their bodies and out. New chemical moving. Anything we can do to help kids be more physical when they're grieving, it's important. And you will notice, especially with little boys, is that they will become very physical. And we think, oh, this is just the typical 9-year-old boy. Well, it may be that, but it's also they need to move. The anxiety and the anxiousness that's part of that experience, they need to move those bodies. Third, children grieve in windows of time. And this is so important as adults for us to understand. Because what we see often is, and I've observed this firsthand, that a child is told, for example, that something has happened, and for maybe 5 minutes, they are sad, they may cry, they may scream, they may kick something, and then they go out and they go back to their Lego building, or they go outside and swing, or they go get whatever it is their buddy and they play. That's it. And you think, oh, well, I guess they're okay, because they're doing this normal thing. But that's not the case. What is going on is that children only have small windows of tolerance for the huge emotions that come up. They know that. And so when they cannot tolerate anymore, they go back to what is normal and feels safe, which if I'm a Lego builder, I'm going to go build Legos. If I'm a football player and I like to play kickball, I'm going to go play kickball with my buddies. And then they'll come back to it. Recognizing that kids can only do this in small windows is really important, because even as we sit down with them to do therapeutic sorts of things, we got to recognize that, yes, attention span is developmental in terms of how it builds, but we're also talking about a whole nother dynamic here, and that is the grief and the window of tolerance that they have. And as soon as they begin to turn away or change the subject or jitter around in their chair or whatever you're doing, then you know we've reached it. We've hit the tolerance. Okay. I want to go back one time. One of the things that I think is important in terms of the children grieve in windows of time is that many grief programs for children are time limited to 6 to 8 weeks. And what we know nationally is that that kind of program is often not very helpful at all, because in an 8-week time, you may catch that child once or twice when they're ready to receive whatever it is you're doing. So the program that programs I've been a part of are year-round programs. They are ongoing. There's not a finite number of weeks. They just come until they don't need to be there anymore. Number 4, children understand death and grief according to their particular developmental phase. And we're going to talk specifically about each of those phases and what they understand about death shortly. But I think it's just important to recognize that anytime we're working with a child who's grieving, the first thing we want to look at is, how old are they? What's the developmental phase that they're in at this point? What are the developmental tasks of a child that age? Okay. Number 5, children revisit losses over their lifespan. And that's the one that I was talking about earlier when I talked about the basic assumptions of grief, that it's cumulative and we revisit over a lifetime. Children are going to do this pretty regularly, like when they have a birthday. That's one of those pivotal moments when someone that normally is there at their birthday is now gone. And that's a big deal. It's revisiting that loss again, the absence. Or perhaps it's when the first time they learn to ride a bike and somebody's not there to celebrate that with them. All kinds of firsts that happen with children. And all of those moments are times when often kids re-experience the absence of whomever it was that died, or it may also be maybe the divorce. So, and I should have said this at the beginning, when we talk about grief and loss, we're not just talking about death. Children have lots of experiences of loss that don't involve death. So it could be a divorce. It could even be a grandparent that was living with you that moves out and is now in a assisted living and not a part of the day-to-day life, that maybe's been there with most of the time that child was growing up. So there's all kinds of ways to experience loss. This is really important. Grief interrupts or stalls age-appropriate developmental tasks. So, for example, if a child has a traumatic loss, like the sudden death of a parent at age 9, and that death is not appropriately processed, in other words, the trauma is not addressed in a trauma appropriate way, it is quite possible that the developmental tasks of a 9-year-old are not going to get accomplished at a 9-year-old age. It may take them until they're 12 or 15 because they kind of get stalled out. I have worked with adults who had traumatic losses as teens, who in many ways, the developmental tasks of a teen were not accomplished. They're 40 years old, but some of those developmental tasks have not happened. It gets stalled out. So it's important for us to watch what's going on with children and whether or not they are accomplishing those tasks in those developmental phases. Does that make sense? Or Jill? Okay, all right. This is another really important one. I can tell you a couple of stories about this. Children secretly blame themselves. Because children, certainly up to age 7 or 8, are very egocentric. It's appropriate. They are. And it doesn't go away totally, as you all know who have teens, and some adults, actually. But because of that, everything that happens must be about me. And I can't emphasize that enough. I'll give you an example. A little boy that came to our grief center in Houston, he had been out playing basketball with his dad one evening after dinner. His dad had a massive heart attack and died right in front of it. When he came for his interview before he started our program, I said, "Tell me what you understand about how Daddy died." He said, "Well, the day he died, I begged and pleaded to him to please play basketball with me after dinner. He didn't want to play. He said he was too tired. And if I hadn't made him play, he would be alive. He wouldn't have had that heart attack." Putting dots together, and they don't really match. Cause and effect, not true. Another child, and this was a very young child, 3-year-old, almost 4, whose mother had died of a breast cancer. Not suddenly, but probably more quickly than many. And her daddy brought her in, and she was sitting on his lap, and I was sitting beside them. And I asked the same question, tell me about your mom and how she died. What do you know about that? She said, "Well, she breastfed me a lot, and then she died of breast cancer." Now, she didn't say it was her fault, but do you hear it? She put those two things together. Daddy's eyes got about as big as a deer in the headlight, as you can imagine. He had no idea that's what was going through her head. So children, it's just almost an exception to have a child that doesn't blame themselves in some way. So part of what I've always done in groups with children and individually too is not to say to them, "Oh, no, it's not your fault," because that doesn't work very well. But simply to say, "I wonder if there are any other reasons why this could have happened." And to begin to plant seeds that might at some point be able to make sense to that child so that the story begins to change and they don't carry blame around most of their life. And many kids do. I mean, I've had come upon teenagers and I've come upon adults who talked about a death they had that was in their family as a young child, and all their life they carried the guilt about that, which really wasn't theirs to carry. Children who are grieving often experience their world as out of control. And I'm sure you could guess why, because when something like that happens in a family, what happens? All kinds of things change, right? I mean, everything from sometimes people have to move, Sometimes there's somebody else who comes in to care for them that they don't know until that person arrives. The roles in a family change and shift when someone dies. All kinds of things happen. Sometimes kids have to change schools. Sometimes they have to change the opportunity to see and be with grandparents. It's just a myriad of transitions and changes. And because of that, it feels out of control. Nobody says to them, would it be okay if we did? I mean, and nor should they. It's not the child's decision. But the fact is that it feels totally out of their control. And that makes a child anxious, just like it does us. I don't know about you, but I kind of like to be in control. Any of you like to be in control? Yeah. Kids like to be in control too. And when they begin to have that sense that there's no control and I can't predict what's going to happen next, they're going to be anxious, really anxious. Ninth, children grieve as a part of a family system, and we cannot forget this. It's so easy to look at a child and just look at their grief and not consider what's going on in them at home, with them at home. The way a family handles crisis and grief teaches a child how to grieve. And an example would be, there's kind of three pictures in my head, as if you were to have a camera over the top of a home and you would see what's happening. There's the family that gathers together and talks about what has happened and how everybody's doing and what people need. There's the family that you would see everybody scattered to their own room, isolate, and they only come out when they think they've got it put together, right? And there's the family that it's a kind of a combination, but one of the healthy things you see is that some people go outside the family and they talk to people like a youth minister or a teacher or the mother or father of a friend, and they begin to do resourcing, which children wouldn't know that word, but they do know that they need someone safe to talk to. That's a really healthy family that is given the message that it's okay for you to do that. Unfortunately, one of the messages kids often get is, we don't talk about this outside the family. Why? I'm not real sure, because there's nothing to be ashamed of about grief, but it happens. I know it does, because I've had children tell me that, I'm not supposed to talk to other people. So children grieve as a part of a family system, and the pictures that you see up here are kind of metaphors that I have used. Think about a mobile that you create with each member of the family hanging from a central place, and you take one picture off, and what happens to all the others? What happens? It's imbalanced. They all jiggle around, don't they? And that's what happens in the family. Everybody's out of place. Everybody's trying to figure out where ground central is. Where's the balance? And it takes a while when you're holding that thing and you pull one off. It takes may take a couple of minutes for things to find their balance. In real time, we're talking months and months and maybe years if it's not addressed. So one of the things that I always say to parents is that your children are going to take the lead from you in regard to how to grieve. It's so important for us to be real with our children. That doesn't mean that we fall apart in front of them or decompensate in front of them. But it does mean that they're going to see tears, because tears are a normal way. Tears are a way that we are allowed to express sadness or pain. And they're going to see somebody angry that maybe wads up a piece of paper and throws it. Or maybe they even stomp their feet. Or when they're by themselves, they yell, but not at somebody. Anger's okay. And we can do that together as long as we're not hurting ourselves or someone else. But if none of those things happen in the presence of our children, They don't know that it's okay to express feelings. There's also a roller coaster there, and that's because it really is a roller coaster ride in terms of family dynamic. Some of you know because I spoke here before, but we had a death of a 16-year-old in 1989, and I had a daughter who was 11 at the time, and my husband and I. And there were days that we were just pulled in together and doing this thing together in a beautiful way. And there were days when it was darn hard to do that. And I'm sure that Jennifer, my daughter, wondered what she was coming home to some days. Was it going to be a day when mom was upset, or was it going to be a day when mom was really balanced? And talking about those things is really important. We got to the point where we had a thing on the refrigerator that before we could leave, we had to post how we were feeling. We had to put a little magnet thing on there that said, I'm not having a good day, or I'm sad, or I'm mad, or whatever. All of us did. And that way, I knew what I was walking into with my husband. She knew what she was walking into with us, and we with her. It was a way of communicating feelings that felt safe at that point. So let's talk about developmentally how this plays out. So if we're looking at grief through the eyes of a child, it means that we have to consider the developmental age and stage of the child. When we think about language, how do we talk about death? One of the common stories when children come in, and one of our things on our registration form is I would ask the parent, tell me the language used when this child was told about the death. Why do you think I would do that? Any ideas? The reason is because depending on what language we use, that may be the source of some of the pain and anger of the child. For example, the child whose dad died in the hospital and the doctor came out and said, we lost your father. We lost your father. Not he died. We lost him. 6 weeks later, he came into my office and he was mad. I mean, mad. He sat down, he folded his arms and looked away from me and said, I'm not talking to you. I said, I get it. Something awful's happened in your family. I get it. And I said, you seem really angry, and I really understand that. And he said, no, you don't. I said, well, tell me about it. He said, I want to know why they're not looking for him. Nobody's upset about the fact that he got lost. Where is he? Language is important. Language is really important. We don't have newspapers anymore to look at, but when I used to look at the newspaper and I would look at the notifications of deaths, it was very interesting how few times even the notice of death uses the word dead or death. What do we say? What are some things we say? They what? Passed on? What else? Went to heaven? Met their Lord? I mean, all kinds of things. Around children, it's often they were one of God's went to be with God as one of God's angels. Well, that's a really sweet thing, but I can tell you that a child who has a sibling that is told that they're going to be with God because he's one of God's angels does not want to go to sleep because they don't want to be one of God's angels. Language is important. And I know for some of us, we're not accustomed to using that word dead, but it's important. Emotional, we also have to consider, besides the language we use, the emotional tolerance of the child. So what I was talking about earlier about the windows of time, we have to be able to notice when does the child meet their tolerance point? When they get fidgety, when they change the subject, all of those things, you know what I'm talking about. Notice that and don't keep pushing. Grief stance. In other words, what do they understand about grief? What do they understand about how people grieve? And then the fourth thing is, obviously, what are some of the therapeutic ways to be with that child? So the child before the age of 5 basically has no concept of time. Do you know how many times when you tell a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, you're going to be able to go to Johnny's birthday party next Thursday? And it's Sunday? How many times are they going to ask you, is today the day? At least 6 every day. And so they also don't understand the concept of time as in death, as in forever. I mean, think about it. Do we even understand that as adults? We kind of do, but it unfolds over time, doesn't it? A child has no concept of that, this age. And so what happens with this age child around that is that maybe every day, if not more than once a day, that child may say, when's mommy coming back? Or when's daddy coming back? And depending on how the mom or the people around are holding that grief, that's hard. To have to say several times a day, maybe, you know, I know this is hard to understand, but mom isn't coming back. And yet it's an important answer. If we don't answer their questions, they're going to quit asking and they're going to make up their own story. So we need to answer, even if it's a hard answer. Concrete language. Children at this age are concrete learners. So if we say they're lost, that means they're lost, not dad, lost. If we say they passed over, the only thing about passed over they're going to understand is over. So what did they jump over? What did they go past? There's nothing clear about that for a 3 or 4-year-old. And again, if God wanted them as an angel, well then, why wouldn't God want me too? And I don't want to go. Concrete language is the way a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 3-year-old understands, and even early 6-year-olds in some cases. I remember one of the things that we often did with children at our center was sometimes children aren't allowed to go to the funeral, which we'll talk about. It's important that they do, but sometimes they aren't allowed. And so sometimes we would have a funeral in our little group. The kids would get to decide what they wanted to do and what they wanted to say. And we'd bring a picture and we would create a funeral so that they would get to be a part of a funeral for their loved one. And one of the little boys said, but you know, my daddy wasn't buried. And I said, oh, well, tell me about that. He said, well, I don't really understand, but I think my mother said they cooked him. He was cremated. That's the only way a little boy or a little girl's going to understand that. But what he wanted to know, what temperature did he set the oven? That's how concrete a learner these kids are. And we trained our volunteers to be able to answer those questions. Or if they couldn't, they would say, you know what? I'm going to find out. Because they need an answer. They're curious and they're concrete. And we need to be able to respond in ways that says your questions have value. Most 5-year-olds have little or no feeling vocabulary. Some do, if we're really fortunate and they have a parent that really works with them on emotional intelligence. But generally speaking, they don't. And so one of the things that we do in our program, but also is helpful for parents to do, is to begin to help them have names for those feelings. And part of the way that I do that is talking about their body. What are you feeling in your body right now? And they'll, you know, if they're angry, they'll do their fist, or they'll say, something like that, and I'll say, oh, well, maybe that's anger. You think that's anger? And we give a lot of other words for it too. They need to be able to name, not that we always have to name a feeling, but oftentimes giving it a name allows them to move it in a way that without a name, it's hard. It's really hard. Magical thinking. There's been a lot written about magical thinking, and especially in children. And some adults have magical thinking too, but magical thinking means that if I think it, it's real. If I think it, I can make it happen. And it's wonderful that they have the imaginations and the incredible sense of empowerment. However, it's also a real loss when it doesn't come true. And so we have to just listen for that as we're listening to their stories and listening to what's going on at home and all of those kinds of things. Often around children where there's divorce, the magical thinking is, I'm going to get mom and dad back together, almost without failure. And they really think they can do it. And it's all going to be perfect. That's part of the magical thinking. Something I just heard recently that I want to point out, and that is it was a 3-year-old child, and they were talking about the fact that, he's just fine. He's not even paying attention to the fact that his daddy died. He's having tantrums and stuff, but that's typical for 2 or 3-year-olds. Okay, well, yeah, it is. And if a child is old enough to love, it's old enough to grieve. Anyone old enough to love is old enough to grieve. I'm not saying that they maybe aren't doing well with it, but to say that they're not even aware of it is naive. It's just not possible for a child to be in a household where there's been that kind of loss and not feel the impact of that. So then we're going to move to ages 5 to 9. They're still somewhat concrete and literal. Not totally. As they get closer to 9, and the ones that are a little more mature might not be so concrete and literal. But I think we still have to be very careful about language. 5 to 9-year-olds ask a lot of sensate detail questions. They want to know, what did mommy feel? What did she feel in the grave? What did they feel when they were cremated? That's a very detailed, sensory-focused question. And those are questions that are really hard when you're grieving. They're hard because they're raw. And yet, again, we need to answer to the best of our ability and to let them know that question's okay. It's hard not to go, what? But in fact, don't. We have to be very careful that we don't belie that shock of those kinds of questions. They have a growing feelings vocabulary, generally, at that age. They've begun to gain at least the 4 major feelings and probably some others. And we can continue to help them grow that by us describing how we feel and our looking at them and saying, gosh, it looks like maybe you're feeling this. Even if you're wrong, at least they can say, I'm feeling this. And that's a great way for them to distinguish and begin to differentiate between feelings. Ages 5 to 9 still often take responsibility for the death. And part of that not only is because of the me-centered, but because, especially where there have been sudden deaths, the randomness of the death is actually scarier and harder to carry than if I just take responsibility for it. Think about that for a minute. If I take responsibility for it, then my reasoning is, well, I just won't do what I did that made that happen. Or I will do what I didn't do, whatever the situation is. But taking responsibility is more painful, or less painful, than the unpredictability that they experience around a sudden death. Ages 9 to 11, they're beginning to understand death. in that they understand that it is permanent, whatever we mean by that. And again, that's an unfolding understanding, because even for us, we may hear that word and know at some level what it means, and yet there is a longing that begins to feel like not really understanding. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Ages 9 to 11 have a really strong need for control in the world. And not that other kids don't, but there's just something we see accentuated. And as things are happening in the family and things are changing in the family, that often comes out as really oppositional kind of behavior because they don't have control over that. They're not part of those decisions. Anything we can do to involve children, not give them free hand, I don't mean that, but involve them. What would you think about this? Eventually, maybe we have to make a decision that isn't what they wanted, but at least they've been able to talk about it. Ages 9 to 11 have some ability, we hope quite a bit of ability, to self-soothe and modulate their feelings. Up to that age, many children do not have the tools to know how to self-soothe or to bring down a heightened sense of anger or pain. They don't know how to modulate that. They haven't been given the skills or tools. By age 9 to 11, most kids have at least some sense of how to do that. They continue to feel isolated and different at this age. It's still a big piece of it. Ages 12 to 17, they begin to see a really more like an adult understanding of death, of really getting that dad or mom is not going to come back, or sibling. This is the place where we see some of these developmental tasks interrupted and stalled often. And part of that is because that age has probably more developmental tasks than any other, besides the very, very young. Identity and grief struggles. So the age 12 to 17 who has a parent has died or a sibling often will say, I don't want to be the kid whose dad died. I don't want to be the kid whose brother died. I remember my daughter saying that in middle school. I'm tired of being the one whose brother died. Her identity got caught up in the whole story of what happened in our family. And identity is really important at that age because they're figuring out who they are, apart from some of the adults in their world. A lot of confused supports, and by that I mean they go to school and they don't often get the kind of support they need from friends because their friends don't know how to support them. We haven't helped them know how to do that. And it's something that it would be so helpful if we were able to do that in our classrooms and in our school, is to help them to know how to support a classmate who's going through something difficult like this. It's also confused because at home, the very people that they perhaps have leaned on until something happened aren't available to them. You especially hear this in families where there's a child who's died, because quite often mom and dad are so lost in their own grief that they're not as available as the surviving child or children need them to be. I have a very clear body memory even of our daughter right after our son died. We had decided to go away for a few days and just go someplace totally different. We went to visit some friends in Maine and we were at the beach, which was a big family thing for us to go to the beach. And my husband and I were sitting there in the sand staring out into the water in another world. I mean, just not present. And Jennifer came over and she got this far away from me and she said, I need to build a sand castle. I didn't hear her first time. So she got closer. Mom, I need to build a sand castle now. Oh, get it. I get it. There's a lot of layers to that that I won't go into. But she needed me to be present. She needed her daddy to be present. We'd always done those things together. And we were lost. We were someplace else. I'm so grateful that there was something in her that said it was okay to ask, rather than just give up, which often children do. It's so important for us to be there as supports. The 12 to 17-year-old generally does have an ability to modulate their feelings and self-soothe. But I want to say that the major way kids learn this is from you and their teachers and things that they see either on television or other things on their screens, in terms of how do people modulate their feelings, or do they at all? If what they're seeing at home is someone who's able to say, I need to step back because I'm really upset right now and I don't want to say something to hurt, and walk away, if that's what they're seeing, that's a wonderful model. They're going to get that, oh, sometimes it's just better to walk away until you get it together. On the other hand, if they don't see that and they see anger or feelings that just are constantly bleeding over in ways that are hurtful, that's what they're going to do as well. So the way they learn is from us. It's so important. Let's talk about family dynamics. And I talked a little bit about that, but I'll just bring out 5 points. Individuals within the family have their own timing and unique ways of expressing grief. The metaphor that I think about is a merry-go-round. I want you to just picture a merry-go-round. So the merry-go-round's going around in a circle, and on the merry-go-round are horses, and what are they doing? They're going up and down, right? Not together, different, right? Well, that's what it's like in a family. All those horses are individuals in the family, and they're all going up and down at different times. And at the same time, the bigger life cycle of the family continues to move. We're still moving through the life cycle of a family. And everyone is doing it differently. One of the hardest things, I think, in working with folks, families in grief, is how do we negotiate all of those different needs? One story in particular, One story in particular is that a family that the parent, they'd lost a child, and the siblings knew that that family had taken videos of everything in the family. There were all kinds of videos. And they wanted to see the videos of their sibling. And the parents hid them and would not allow that because they couldn't tolerate it emotionally. And so one night in our little group of kids that were together, one or two of the siblings told the story, we want to watch these videos, but mom and dad won't let us see them. So what we were able to do is sit down with the parents and say, your children really want to hear the voice of their sibling. They want to see it. And we know that's really hard for you. Is there a way that we could negotiate? Maybe they could bring a video to group, or maybe they could come and visit me and bring a video, or maybe they could just put a video on and you don't have to watch it with them. Is there a way that everybody can get what they need around this? So those kinds of family dynamics in grief are really important. That was a really big move for those parents to say, okay, they can bring a tape to the group and watch that. Family grief is about reestablishing balance in the system, and that the mobile picture that I gave for you, it's about all that reestablishing. And it takes a while. Because what's changing in the family are the roles in the family. Roles that you didn't even know existed until somebody wasn't there. My son was the jokester. He knew how to take a situation when it was tense and get leverage so that we would all laugh. When he died, there wasn't much laughter in our house. We had to figure out another way. So those kinds of roles in the family are important, and it takes a while for those to be balanced out and filled. Third, how has the family managed stress in the past? Is there a pattern of response? So maybe you never had a death in your family, but maybe you did have something else that happened that was really stressful. Maybe dad was without a job for a while, or mom had to have a big surgery and couldn't do what mom normally did. How did they manage that as a family? So being able to talk about that, what did we do that worked then, and what can we do now? What didn't work? So let's not repeat that. Talking about those patterns. Fourth, children often delay their own process until parents or guardians' grief has stabilized. I want to repeat that because it's so important. Children often delay their own process until parents or guardians' grief has stabilized. So sometimes we see even children as young as 5 or 6 that simply are not grieving. They're not allowing themselves that because they see the brokenness of a parent or both parents, or even grandparents for that matter, if they're in the home quite a bit. They will delay that. And that's not said to make a parent feel guilty. That's said to make help a parent understand that it's not going to be unusual if the day that they begin to feel really okay or really half okay, Susie over here may absolutely implode because it's the first day when she felt safe to have her feelings. It's not about you being okay as far as coming back at you in some way. It's just now she's safe. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Adults model what and how to grieve in a family, and I think I've said that well up to this point. So here's some pictures for the family in grief. The mobile and the merry-go-round. Those are good things to keep in your head when you're looking from the outside at a family or even from the inside. So when we think about tasks of grieving for children, the first thing is to understand that the person is dead and know that if I'm 3, that's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time before I understand that. The second thing is to feel the feelings about the fact that the person has died. That's their task. And third is to go on living and loving after the person has died. And I really want to emphasize that's the end game. We want children to come out on the other side of this as willing to love again. So many adults who have tragic losses make decisions not to love anymore, to close their hearts. We don't want adults, but we certainly don't want children to do that. When we're talking about helping children understand that the person is dead, there are so many wonderful children's books about grief and about death. And I really urge you, if you know of a family that has had a death and has small children, to look that up. Go to whatever your favorite bookstore is and look up children's grief and look at some of those books. I meant to do a bibliography for today and I haven't, but I will send a list to Robin. And if you're interested in it, I think she can put it on the website, right? Okay. Because I've got a bunch of children's books that are wonderful and there are lots of them out there. So I'll send you my list. Just the whole idea of concept of alive and dead. This is one of the things that we do in groups is to say to the child, draw us a picture of what it means when you talk about daddy's alive. And what would that look like if you were going to draw daddy's dead? That's one of the ways they begin to understand what that means. Using the arts of all kinds, movement, drawing, music, drumming, acting, all of those things are so important for children. Imaginative play is critical for children. That's one of the guided imageries that I do with kids. It's called the Magic Carpet Ride. And I will bring in a couple of small carpets, and they pick their magic carpet and sit on it. And I do a guided imagery about taking a ride on a magic carpet ride, and they get to decide where they take the carpet. But and it sounds like, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, part of it is they get to choose. So it's bringing back some of the sense of power that they need. They get to decide where the carpet is going to go. Often children in these groups will take that carpet to wherever they believe daddy or mommy or brother are. And they'll have a conversation. Or several children that I've worked with will find that in the midst of this guided imagery, lo and behold, there's another magic carpet out there. And guess who's on it? Mom or dad or brother. Imaginative play where children get to make choices and get to imagine in unlimited ways is so important in grief. Having kids, just write down, finish this sentence, I don't understand, and they fill it in. I don't understand. This one says, why didn't get to say goodbye? And why was he so young? Those are all questions that probably they haven't felt like they could ask at home, but they could ask it in a session with a therapist or with a group of kids who've all experienced a loss. They can ask those questions. Anger is often an emotion with kids in grief. It's also an emotion with adults in grief. And helping them find ways to do that it's okay. They're not hurting anybody. They're not hurting themselves. And so doing things, we have a punching bag, except that the only rule with the punching bag is that you can't just be physical. You got to use words too. So when you're punching, you got to say something. And it doesn't even have to be a word. It could just be, ugh. But you got to make a sound. And the reason is I don't want the kids to think that just physical violence, physical punching is a way. It's not. We need words. And they know they're not harming anybody when they do the punching bag anyway. I use clay a lot with children in grief, and adults too. But taking a wad of clay and smashing it. It's a great way to take out some anger. If you don't know that as an adult, go get you some clay. It's great. Drumming. I often have the children tell their story of loss with a drum. They don't use any words. They just drum it. And believe me, you know when the death happens, when they're drumming. It's a great exercise. Movement. I don't know if any of you have ever had the game Twister in your house, where they have different colored dots and they have to put a hand or a foot. Well, we do that, except that when they have to put a hand or when they put the red or yellow or gray, they have to draw a card and it asks a question about their grief experience before they put their hand or foot down. Again, it's just a very physical way to do some talking. We do masks with older kids and talk about what's behind the mask. What is on the inside, as you can see on one of those slides, that you don't show to others? And what is it that we're hiding? And how might we be able to share that with others? So in summary, I want to say that it is so important that we listen and we find and use the child's strengths, that we respect the timing of that particular child's grief, that this is about remembering, not forgetting. The goal is integration, balance, and connection. Tools for a life process of restoration. I want to close this part with a little story that's become very meaningful for me. There was a special place my child and I liked to go when we'd take our walks together. We'd walk down the block to where the farmland next to our house stretched out as far as our eyes could see. There was an opening in the sharp barbed wire fence put in place several years ago. It was an invitation for us to enter and enjoy the beauty of the land. It was mostly not used for farming, more like a pasture where the horses and cows grazed sometimes. We had a favorite path we took, not too far, but far enough. It felt like we were someplace far away. A special tree was situated there. We counted the grasshoppers we saw. We listened to the birds, and we visited that special tree across the far fence line. We would often sit in the shade of that tree, maybe share a snack, and always listen for the different sounds around us. But this particular day, we were especially drawn to exploring our tree. It was spring, so the branches were heavy with green and the lacy Spanish moss. We laid down and looked up at the umbrella of leaves and branches hanging over us. Then our attention moved to the trunk of the tree. We noticed something we'd never seen before. Though it seemed it had been this way for a very long time, it seemed the tree trunk had once upon a time grown to meet the barbed wire fence. And the fence, not giving in to the growth to meet the tree, penetrated the tree's trunk. The fence deeply dug into the trunk, and over time, the tree had incorporated the barbed wire into its surface. No stopping that tree from growing, though. It lived on with such determination and strength to tell the long story of a sapling's encounter with a sharp and potentially quite disturbing obstacle in its path. Thank you. And I would be happy to take questions. Okay. What is grieving like for the children of Gaza experiencing death of family as well as starvation? Does the emotional scarring and anxiety last a lifetime, and how can they be helped? So, first of all, I have to say, I'm surmising as a clinician because honestly, that's so big that part of me can't wrap my head around it. But I would say that for the children in Gaza, it is so big that in many ways they're not able to even express that grief because it is simply trauma with a capital T. There is nothing about their lives that is the same as it was before this began. And for some children, it's all they've known. All they've known. For those children, they may be somewhat desensitized because it's almost normal to hear bombs. It's almost normal to see the rubble around them, to be hungry. They don't know any different. And so I guess I would say that, does the emotional scarring and anxiety last a lifetime? Probably yes. And with help, there can be some healing. I doubt that the scars would be gone, but I do think it's possible that there can be healing. And what can we do to help? I think that probably the most we can do to help is to support organizations that are sending in aid, and not just food aid, although that is critical right now. If I'm hungry, I don't really care much about my feelings, right? So food, water, sustenance, but also any organizations that you might know that are also sending in social workers and counselors and people to be of that kind of help. I wish I had so much more to be able to say about that, but it is a prayer every day for me that there is some relief for those kids.
Thank you so much for that. you know, we're all going to have to deal with this with our children or our grandchildren, and it's good to know what to say. Our next presentation is on August 24th, so if you'll mark your calendars for that, it's going to be presented by Eric Shepard, and his subject is PTSD. He has lived experience, and he's an advocate for veterans and others, so it's not just for veterans who are suffering from PTSD. So we'd like to have you come for that. I think it's going to be a really don't miss presentation. Thank you for joining us today, those of you by Zoom and those of you here in person. We hope to see you again on August 24th. And in the meantime, please take good care of your mental health as well as of those that you love. Thank you.